Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to this part 2 of the Harlem Renaissance first workshop. Okay, so I'll talk more specifically about Harlem now. I'm going to read a bit. So Harlem, New York took its place as a major cultural centre in the 1920s, after the decline of Greenwich Village as a major locus of American experimental art. In the 1910s, Greenwich Village had become one of the most important sites of literary and cultural experimentation. But in the wake of the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution in the form of prohibition, no alcohol, dispossessed intellectuals began to migrate uptown to take advantage of cheap rents in the black slums north of 110th Street. And that's what you can see in this image. This is kind of an image of Harlem, and you can see 110th Street at the bottom there. So the thing about Harlem and what we should kind of understand about Harlem at the time was that actually, instead of being a site of singularly black experience or as a kind of black form of expression only, one of the important meanings of Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance was its capacity for interracial mixing. So Harlem itself was a site of interracial mixing. You had a lot of white people coming up from downtown to spend time in Harlem or to live in Harlem alongside its black residents. But this claim is in some ways deceiving. For African Americans, Harlem became an important site to experiment with new forms of urban living. This is part of what's called the Great Migration, which I alluded to earlier, which was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural Southwest United States to the urban Northeast, Midwest, and West that occurred after the abolition of slavery and World War I. So what you had in the kind of 1910s specifically, but also slightly after that, was a big migration of African Americans out of the South, where they were kind of living rural lives, working as farm labourers, earning not very much, into the urban North. And so a factor of this obviously is industrialisation, so there were more jobs becoming available in factories, in kind of more urban work. So there was a big influx of African Americans into the kind of urban cities of the North. So New York, but also places like Chicago, also places like Baltimore, like Washington, etc. Over 200,000 Black people ended up in Harlem by 1930. As the prominent writer and civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson put it, Harlem became, quote, the Negro capital of the world. So this quite small space, really, Harlem, as you can see on the map here, was a really kind of concentrated area for African Americans in the early 1920s, 1930s. And I think it's an interesting question, and it's one we'll come back to on this course, about whether Harlem represents a kind of form of autonomous Black identity formation, so a kind of self-governing sense of what it means to be Black in the earlier 20th century. But it's also a place where there's interracial mixing happening. So you've got white patrons living in Harlem, working with Black writers and Black literary figures, Black musicians, and this question of kind of living together across races is also prominent in Harlem. So Harlem itself, therefore, became a kind of Black mirror, you could say, set against kind of suburban white American culture. So what we might think of in a kind of traditional kind of white American white picket fence, very kind of domestic scene, Harlem is a kind of interesting inversion of that, particularly if you think about urban living. So what I mean by that is kind of what's called tenement buildings, so flats where people live really close to each other. So there was a kind of big influx of different kinds of architecture in New York at that time. So apartment buildings where people live really in close proximity to each other and built a kind of sense of community through that. And then that kind of later on becomes the slums, which is taken to a kind of different level, I suppose. And the sort of 1920s was also the period of prohibition, and Harlem quickly became known for its speakeasies, bars and cafes that illegally sold alcohol. And it saw an influx of white patrons looking for entertainment at places like the Cotton Club, where they could listen to some of the best Black performers of the time. So you have this amazing kind of vibrant music, nightlife scene happening in Harlem in the 20s as well. And another kind of thing I wanted to mention in this section about Harlem is the relationship that's emerging here between artistic expression, so being able to find your voice as a Black writer or a Black thinker, and the radical politics that was also emerging at the time. So if nightclubs were the lighter side of life, the heavier side can be characterized by two marches in New York. The first, in 1917, involved up to 10,000 Black Americans walking down Fifth Avenue on March the 12th after a major race riot. It was led by the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. And this march in 1917 was a protest against lynching, disenfranchisement, limitation of opportunity, and segregation. So if you look at what's happening in the United States right now with Black Lives Matter, you could definitely draw the parallels, and this is kind of a further, Black Lives Matter is a kind of furthering of some of these same issues which were happening in the early 20th century. Juxtapose this march with the second, which was in 1919, which celebrated the homecoming of the 369th Infantry Regiment, an all-Black regiment known as Harlem's Hellfighters. So these were the first Black soldiers who fought in World War I on behalf of the United States. So if the first march became an image of Black empowerment and solidarity through peaceful protest, the second demonstrated that African Americans were already participating in the protection and development of the nation. They were not second-class citizens. Harlem then seemed to be waking up to the possibility of a powerful and proactive Black politics. After all, the disappointment of the post-Civil War decades, the atmosphere in general was constructive. So you've got both a march that's signifying the demand for civil rights. I suppose you could see it as an early incantation of a civil rights demand, but also a second march in 1919, which demonstrates that Black people were already in the middle of society at that time, because they were already fighting in World War I. So instead of feeling like they were segregated, they were already part of a kind of sense of nation building. So I'm just going to briefly touch on some of these figures, because they're very central to the Harlem Renaissance, and hopefully you've come across some of them before. So you've got Alan Locke, who put together the anthology, The New Negro, that we're looking at this week. You've got Franz Boas, who kind of was a leading figure in the creation of anthropology at Columbia University. And we've got Dubois, whose idea of double consciousness, hopefully you've come across. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. So Dubois actually became the head of the NAACP in 1910. But interestingly, Dubois advocated to exclude things like the blues and jazz from an initial understanding of what kind of Black intellectual life might look like. So there's a kind of interesting classism in early Dubois. So that is to say that the Black Renaissance in Harlem was determined principally by class. It was not an all-inclusive kind of period. And, you know, these figures that I've just shown you here actually represent a kind of middle and upper class Black society that is quite different from how most Black people lived at the time. But what's interesting in the Harlem Renaissance is how the kind of upper and lower class mixed together in Harlem. So if you went to a nightclub, you were as likely to find the lower class there, as well as kind of white patrons who are more middle class. So Claude McKay's got a great novel called Home to Harlem, where he talks much more about the working class life of Black people at that time, and he's himself Caribbean. And that's another aspect I wanted to just emphasize, which is the ethnic diversity of Harlem. So Harlem at the time included African Americans, but it also included Africans, Caribbean, Black immigrants like Claude McKay. And so the Harlem Renaissance cannot be seen in any way as a kind of homogenous movement. You've got a multitude of different people involved, of different kind of classes, of different races, of different ethnicities. Okay. So I'm next going to move on to talk briefly about Langston Hughes, who's one of the poets we're going to be looking at today. And Hughes is a really interesting figure because he was definitely a figure of the populace. Like, he was very well respected by, he was very popular as a poet and as a writer, but he wasn't that necessarily very well respected by the critics at the time. But he was the first Black American to earn his living solely from writing and from giving public lectures. And part of the reason he was able to do this was because of the phenomenal acceptance and love he received from the average Black person. So a reviewer for Black World noted in 1970, quote, "Those whose prerogative it is to determine the rank of writers have never rated him highly. But if the weight of public response is any gauge, then Langston Hughes stands at the apex of literary relevance among Black people. The poet occupies such a position in the memory of his people precisely because he recognised that we possess within ourselves a great reservoir of physical and spiritual strength, and because he used his artistry to reflect this back to the people." So Hughes brought a varied and colourful background to his writing. Before he was 12 years old, he had lived in 6 different American cities. When his first book was published, he had already been a truck driver, farmer, cook, waiter, college graduate, sailor, and doorman at a nightclub in Paris, and he'd visited Mexico, West Africa, the Canary Islands, Holland, France, and Italy. As David Littlejohn observed in his Black on White, a critical survey of writing by American Negroes, quote, "On the whole, Hughes' creative life was as full, as varied, and as original as Picasso's, a joyful, honest, and monument of a career. There was no noticeable sham in it, no pretension, no self-deceit, but a great, great deal of delight and smiling and irresistible wit. If he seems for the moment upstaged by angrier men, by more complex artists, if different views engage us necessarily at this stage of the race war, he may well outlive them all and still be there when it's over." So Hughes' greatness seems to derive from his anonymous unity with his people. He seems to speak for millions, which is a tricky thing to do. So interesting that he's a kind of poet of the people, but not that respected by the critics. And this is a quote from Hughes in The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, which I hope you've also maybe had a look at previously, if not this year. So Hughes says, "We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too." So there's a real sense of self-determination in Hughes here. He is not that bothered about what white people think of him. If they're pleased, we are glad, but if they're not, it doesn't matter. He's not out to impress white people. He's out to speak on behalf of Black people. And there's also this question about not trying to glamorize Black life. So we know we are beautiful and ugly too. So there was a question in the early 20th century about how Black people should be presenting themselves because they've been kind of fictionalized and lied about for so many years. There was a kind of a sense in which you might have to put your best foot forward and not kind of demonstrate the ugliness of Black life. But people like Hughes and also later on people like Toni Morrison are very much interested in showing both sides of that coin. So they're not interested in idealizing in any way the realities of Black life. So this is just another quote which explores Hughes's place in kind of literary culture, talking about him addressing his poetry to the people. He's not interested in esoteric or kind of avant-garde or too experimental poetry. He uses very plain language and ideas familiar to anyone. And I think that's part of his popularity. So in Hughes' own words, his poetry is about, quote, Workers, roustabouts and singers and job hunters on Lenox Avenue in New York, or 7th Street in Washington, or South State in Chicago. People up today and down tomorrow, working this week and fired the next, beaten and baffled, but determined not to be wholly beaten, buying furniture on the instalment plan, filling the house with rumours to help pay the rent, hoping to get a new suit for Easter and pawning that suit before the 4th of July. So I really like this quote because I really think it captures the kind of sense of the working class proletariat being a kind of Marxist term, that Hughes is really interested to writing about. And he talks about the precarity, I think, the precariousness of Black experience here. So people up today and down tomorrow. There's no sense of security in Black life at this time. You're working this week and fired the next. Quite a lot of interesting parallels with our own moment, perhaps, where people have kind of much less job security than they once did. People buying furniture on the instalment plan. So you're not able to kind of plan for the future. You're only able to kind of pay off things in terms of debt. There's a lot of interesting things going on in this quote. But Hughes is determined to write about these workers as they experience life, not in any kind of idealized fashion. And just at the bottom, we've got another critic called Fuller commentated that Hughes, quote, chose to identify with plain Black people precisely because he saw more truth and profound significance in doing so. And that's, again, a kind of quite a radical move for the earlier 20th century, where a lot of the time literature had been about the upper classes, about, you know, the aristocracy, about people who were kind of living very upper middle class lives. And Hughes decided not to kind of capture any of that, but instead look at plain Black people. Okay, so your next kind of task as part of this workshop is going to be to pick one of these 3 poems. So the first one is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which is quite an early Hughes poem. It's very beautiful. And also I'd recommend you going on YouTube, and you can listen to him reading it as well. We might do that in seminars too. So pick one of these 3, and I'll show you at the end what the tasks are. So the second one is called I Too Sing America. So you could pick that one. And the final poem to maybe pick is called Harlem, and it's a later poem, kind of at the end of the Harlem Renaissance period. I think this poem is really amazing in the way it speaks to what's happening with Black Lives Matter right now. So you could read it through that lens if you wanted to. So pick one of those 3, and you can just Google them and find them online if you don't want to pause the video. And then close read it before the seminar, and consider the following aspects. So I want you to think about poetic voice here. So what is the voice of the poem? How is kind of Hughes positioning himself in relation to his own voice and the poetic voice? Think about the choice of language. Why is Hughes writing this kind of register, this kind of very plain, simplistic language? Think about the poetic form. So look out for rhymes, look out for kind of interesting stanzas and poetic structures in the poem. And finally, think about address and audience. So who is Hughes' audience here? That might sound like an easy question, but also think about the way he is addressing that audience. So why is he speaking to them in this way? And what's he hoping to what's his motivation? What's he hoping to get out of the poem? Or what's he hoping to kind of inspire or invoke in his reader? Okay, so please have a go at this close reading before the seminar.